Well, hello there. I'm wearing a tie. And the reason I'm wearing a tie is because I'm going to talk with you today about CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, sometimes called cognitive behavioral therapy. I think those two can be used interchangeably. And it just feels right. It feels right for me to be wearing a tie in order to talk with you about CBT. And so I am now pulling up my PowerPoint and I will get myself ready with the first PowerPoint. And there we go. All right. So the title of today's talk, which is Day 6 in the Evidence-Based Happiness for Educators course, is cognition. We're focusing on what you think. And so you can see there the little tagline, you are what you think, or the joke tagline is, or maybe you're just whatever you worry about. Because oftentimes we are filled with worry. I have been filled with worry off and on all day, yesterday and today, about various things, almost all of which are not in my control, but I still worry about them. And I'm sure you have many things that you worry about as well. Some announcements, really only today is day 6. We are going to explore this thing between our ears. It's our brain. Our brain does much more than just give us specific thoughts, but it's a big part of what our brains do. The thing to remember, it's day 6, but your pace is your pace for this class. We do have an end date by which we need to submit grades to the University of Montana if you're taking this for credit. And so the deadline for everything to be in, if you're taking it for credit, is August 18th. And I hope you're feeling a little bit better. I know some people were feeling overwhelmed at the workload. Again, we want you to be somewhat selective in terms of what you read and what you try. And so that's the plan. That's the breaking news. What's happening? I know also some people are concerned about grades. Big surprise, teachers concerned about grades because you're all amazing overachievers, which is great. So I would say that it's really important for you to remember what Yoda said, do or don't do. I guess I don't really like that saying, but it fits in this case. When you do the assignments, like the active learning assignments, will you get 10 points? Well, unless you just like write one sentence and blow the whole thing off, if you just write a few thoughtful sentences about your experience trying out the active learning activities, try to follow the instructions, it's going to be 10 points or 0 points. You get points for doing. And of course, we want you to put some effort into it, but every single active learning assignment does not need to be a masterpiece. On the other hand, if you want it to be a masterpiece, that's perfectly fine too. It's really up to you. So previously, I had talked about how positive goals and even sometimes positive experiences can trigger negative thoughts. And Stephen Hayes, in the video that we watched together, talked about what are we going to do? What are you going to do? How are you going to handle your troubling thoughts? And he has his approach, and he talked about that. I do think that oftentimes with positive experiences, I know many people who then start, if things are going too well, they start to feel a little bit superstitious, like, uh-oh, what is going to go wrong? I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. I don't even know where that saying comes from, but I know what it means. And it means things have been going so well, I'm actually just waiting for something bad to happen. It's true, the way humans are built, all natural, perfectly normal, to review negative events and anticipate negative events. Sometimes we're anticipating negative events that really have hardly any chance of happening. And so What I would like you to do to start with, an opening question for you, is to reflect on one minor or one moderately negative thought that you recently had. And we're going to say about yourself, but it also might be about some situation in your life. It could be, and in cognitive therapy, we often talk about this thing that we do called catastrophizing. And so it might be that something happened, and it was a small thing, but you start to catastrophize about what it might end up being eventually. And so just let yourself reflect on some minor, moderately negative thought you recently had. Could be about yourself, could be about the future, could be about the world, could be about other people. We're going to use this for some personal CBT because one of the subtitles of this presentation is CBT for you, which actually is CBT on you. And so you'll be working on yourself a little bit. I want to just make a few comments about cognition. Now, cognition is the fancy word that we use in counseling and psychotherapy to refer to thoughts. Cognition can be images. Cognition can be words that get in our brain. Cognition can be, in some ways, sensations, because sensations come from our perception of things in our bodies. Cognition is, it involves our attitudes, our assumptions, all that constitute, and more, constitutes cognition. I want to make the case right now that cognition is the real boss of you. Your thoughts are really what are in charge. I know in recent years, people have gotten all focused and hung up on the idea that we need to be emotion focused and that our emotions are what really is driving us. Not true, not true. Now, I want to say that, of course, I'm doing CBT today. And so since I'm doing CBT, there's no way that I'm going to acknowledge the primacy of emotion over cognition, because that's partly the role I'm playing, but also I'm serious. Emotions, for the most part, come from cognition. Here's why. Let's say you are lying in bed and you hear a sound in the night, the bump in the night. You hear it, you wake up. What do you feel? What emotions come? If you think about that scenario, I am betting you would say to yourself, well, the emotion that comes depends. It depends on the kind of sound it was. Well, of course, but let's say it was a indeterminate sound, a thud, a crash. You don't know what happened. Usually in the night, when those kinds of sounds happen, people feel fear and anxiety. There is a negative anticipation of what the thump or the bump or the sound in the night meant, what it represents. And my point with you is that you cannot feel any emotion unless you have a perception of what the bump in the night might represent. All that happens super fast. And so it might feel like, oh, I just woke up scared of that bump in the night. But also there might be thoughts of the axe murderer. Of course, that's a classic one, because we get trained to have those thoughts by watching lots of movies about axe murderers who break into houses at night. One time we were we were dog sitting. A dog named Gus, one of our good friends, was out of town. She said, will you take care of Gus? And I said, yeah, sure, we'll take care of Gus. Gus was a Weimaraner. I don't even know if I said that right. Anyway, Gus was a little bit high strung. And so often when our friend was gone in the night, I would hear a bump. And sometimes the way Gus liked to do it was Gus would ram his head into our door, bam. And so during the time that we were dog sitting Gus, when I heard bumps in the night, although ordinarily a bump in the night would make me scared and I would be worried about someone having broken in, maybe not an axe murderer, but maybe someone frightening. Ordinarily, I would have felt afraid or fear or at least a little anxiety. When I heard a bump in the night, I felt annoyed. I felt angry. I was angry that Gus was interrupting my sleep. So my contention is it depends. Our immediate emotional reactions can be of different flavors. Could be sadness, could be fear, could be anger, could be guilt, could be anything on that sort of palette of emotion that we could have. What drives it, what makes it so, is what we perceive, what we think, how we interpret the bump in the night. It's all about cognition. Another story, I'm working at a nuclear facility actually for a year, and I had to do pre-retirement seminars for the people who were retiring, and apparently there were a lot of them because I had to do a pre-retirement seminar for 150 people who were retiring. And I was about 30, so I had no real sense of retirement, which I'm starting to get now, a sense of it. And so I was super nervous, and I had to go do the presentation at 1 o'clock. I remember, because I also remember thinking, there's no way am I eating anything. I'm too nervous. I don't like to eat before I present anyway, but I was especially nervous because I'm lecturing to a bunch of older adults with much more life experience than I have about retirement, which I had no real lived experience around. So I don't eat. I do the presentation. It goes from 1 to 2. I get back to my office about 2:30. I am starving. And, I'm really relieved the presentation was over. I get to my desk. There's a bowl of cherries. And there's a note from the woman who asked me to do the presentation saying, "John, it went great. Thanks for presenting. Enjoy the cherries." And I was ready to enjoy the cherries. I just boom, boom, boom. I started eating them. They were so good. It was incredible. I probably had eaten 10 or 12 cherries. And then I look at the bowl and I can see there are leaves, which would indicate that the cherries came off of someone's tree, maybe very fresh. And then I saw a cherry that didn't look very good. And so I thought to myself, uh-oh, there could be worms in these cherries. So I did stay with my scientific thinking, and I thought, well, I'm going to check it out. I break open the bad looking cherry, and sure enough, there are 2 of those little white maggoty worms crawling around the pit of the cherry. And I am immediately starting to feel sick. But I think to myself, wait a minute, wait, I'm a scientist. I'm gonna look at one of the really good cherries that does not look like it has any worms, and I break it open, and sure enough, even though they're smaller, there's still 2 of those little maggoty worms crawling around. And now I'm starting to do some math in my head. I'm thinking I probably ate 10 cherries. There are probably 20 worms. I don't know why there's 2 in each of them, but probably 20 worms in my belly. And I start to feel nauseated. I start to feel sick. And I'm sitting in my office, leaning forward, I think, just feeling sick. And one of my colleagues, another psychologist, walks by, and he's a solution-focused oriented psychologist, which tells you something about him, which I like to make fun of, and I like to make fun of back then too. Anyway, so he walks by and he looks at me and says, "John, you look terrible. What's going on?" I tell him what happened. He goes, "Oh no, John. Those worms, they could be lodged in your brain by now." And I tell him, "Shut up, leave me alone." And he says, "No, wait, seriously. You should actually feel good because they're really high in protein, they're low in fat, and they're a delicacy in many countries." And I just tell him, "Get out of my office and leave me alone." Obviously, solution-focused therapists have no empathy, but it really didn't matter because he kind of shook up the way I was thinking about things. And I started thinking, well, wait a minute. probably true. They probably are a delicacy. And then really what I started thinking was, I used to eat so many cherries off the trees around the house where I grew up. And I remember my parents saying, don't eat the cherries. They haven't been sprayed, and we'd eat them anyway. Never got sick. So I started feeling better. So I went from feeling great, having done the presentation and started to eat a bowl of cherries, to feeling really pretty sick physically, and also thinking some really negative thoughts about myself, like how could I be so stupid as to just start eating these cherries. And then I went from that to feeling okay. Now, I did not eat any more cherries. I think that was a good decision, but I went from great to terrible to pretty good, all in the span of maybe 30 seconds, maybe less. So what's the moral to the story? You should be answering that. What's the moral to the story? So Albert Ellis, one of the early figures in cognitive therapy, or CBT, attributes a lot of what's called a cognitive appraisal theory to a Greek Stoic named Epictetus, who said or wrote, people are disturbed not by things, but by the view which they take of them. Another way we talk about it is, it's not what happens to us that makes us feel miserable. It's what we think about what happens to us that makes us feel miserable. And so what happened with the cherries? My thoughts changed from when I noticed the possibility of worms to when I started to go down a spiral into negative thoughts about having eaten the cherries and what they might be doing in my stomach, to, I've eaten wormy cherries before. I'll survive. Very quickly, the brain shifts. So what cognitive therapy or cognitive theory or cognitive appraisal theory is all about is it emphasizes our individual unique processing of whatever we perceive, the environmental stimuli, that's the force that determines our specific responses. And I have a drawing that illustrates that. The old stimulus response, you can see up at the top, the old stimulus response model is there's a stimulus and then we give a response. But B.F. Skinner, a famous behaviorist, used to say the brain is a black box. We don't know what happens in there. We cannot consider it. It's nothing. Boom. What happens is stimulus and response. Now, what the cognitive people said was, yes, there's stimulus. What happens to us? We eat wormy cherries. And there's response. We feel sick or we feel fine. What makes the difference is interpretation, or a big I, or our beliefs about what happened to us, or sometimes people refer to it as our construal. In other words, how we construe what happened to us is what dictates, to a large part, our response. And you can see, again, some of my excellent art skills here on display. That is me trying to use some positive self-talk. So the question is, how shall we handle our pesky and problematic thoughts? Certainly Stephen Hayes had some ideas. I've got him listed along with mindfulness-based cognitive therapy on the bottom here. But Albert Ellis had a different view. Said we should vigorously fight back against our irrational ideas and eliminate them. Now think about that language. Irrational ideas. Ellis emphasized that we often have these foundational, irrational ideas, and they get triggered by specific situations, and we need to fight back. We need to use logic and rational thinking to fight back against the irrational ideas. It's very much a Greek Stoicism. That's the approach that Albert Ellis is emphasizing. Now, Aaron and Judith Beck, father-daughter team, Aaron recently passed away, over 100 years old. He was doing research, I think, into his late 90s. His daughter has been a very prolific writer in terms of cognitive behavior therapy. They would say we don't vigorously need to fight back, although if it works, it works. Instead, they would say we need to gently examine our thoughts, become more aware of them, and then examine them, question them using a technique they called Socratic questioning, and then modify our thinking when we find it maladaptive. And they really focused on two things. Are the thoughts helpful? Are the thoughts accurate? And that when they are inaccurate or unhelpful, that's when we need to question, modify them, and start to shift our thinking. Donald Meichenbaum, who came along a bit after Ellis and the Becks, said, really, we can handle this by intentionally integrating helpful inner speech into our daily lives. That inner speech is often what drives our problems and what helps us solve our problems. So we should talk to ourselves in ways that are really like coaches, like good friends. And then, of course, we listened to Stephen Hayes. We watched Stephen Hayes. We talked a bit about that perspective, which really is that our thoughts are not facts. And so we should notice them because they're normal. And we should also let them be. We should let them pass. We should not take them too seriously because we don't need to take them too seriously. We can choose to take them more seriously or less seriously, depending upon how they are and whether they're helpful or useful. But first, so what do we do? How are we gonna deal with these problematic thoughts using CBT or using ACT or using mindfulness-based cognitive therapy? We have to cultivate awareness. Awareness is the foundation because we have to be aware of our thoughts in order to make changes in our thinking. This is why CBT is not for everyone. Not everyone really even has the interest of being aware of being aware of their thoughts. And some people, certainly this is some of the research on special ed kids who maybe have some weaknesses in the area of cognitive processing. Cognitive therapy is really contraindicated. More importantly, are some behavioral approaches or relationship approaches for people who have less of an orientation toward thinking. So how do we become aware of our thoughts? How do we become aware of what works well for us in terms of cognition and the way we think? So some ideas from cognitive therapy, a couple of demonstrations, and then I'll show a short video. So there's a thing called the lemon test. And so I want you to walk along with this test with me right now. So I want you to imagine that there is a lemon sitting in front of you. Maybe it's on your desk, maybe it's on your table. So you can see the lemon, okay? I want you to imagine you can see it. The lemon is yellow. And then I ask you to put on some blue glasses. You put on the blue glasses, and then you look at the lemon. And then the question is, what color is the lemon now? If you're like many people, you would think to yourself, okay, well, my lenses are blue. The lemon is yellow. Therefore, I know from my science classes that the lemon is green. And people will often say, oh, the lemon is green. And yet, what we say as cognitive therapists back is, no, the lemon is still yellow. It just looks green. And that's used as an example of how our cognitions really are lenses that we are looking through all the time. And sometimes we're looking through them all the time so much that we start to think that the lemon is in fact blue because we're so used, not blue, I mean green. We're so used to seeing it that way. We forget that it's our cognition that we're looking through to see the lemon. Another example from cognitive therapy that sometimes helps people recognize the power of imagery in particular on humans is for you to do a visualization activity with me. Sorry, I'm having some trouble speaking. I'll see if I can get better. So I'd like you to do this visualization activity with me. Once again, I want you to imagine yourself in your mind's eye. This time, I want you to imagine that you're in your kitchen. You can look around, you can see what's in your kitchen, and you see the refrigerator. And then you walk up to the refrigerator and you open it. And when you open the fridge, you can feel that little puff of cool air. You can sense that puff of cool air. And you look in, and on one of the racks in the fridge is a lemon, a yellow lemon. And you reach in, and you can see your hand reach in, and you take the lemon. You can feel the coolness of the peel. You take it out of the fridge, shut the door. And then you take the lemon over and you walk up and you place it on a cutting board. You get out a knife, and of course, you're going to be very careful. But you take the lemon and you cut it the long way. Boom. So you have two halves of the lemon. And when you cut it, as you cut it, you can see the juice come out onto the cutting board. You can see there's some pulp. You can see seeds. And then you decide, for whatever reason, you're going to cut one of those halves in half again. So you have 2 quarter lemons and 1 half lemon. And so then you take, and you can see your hand go down, and you pick up one of the quarter lemons, and you take it and you put it in your mouth, and you feel the juice and the sensation of that juice just spreading through your mouth. You can feel the sensation of sourness. You can taste the lemon, you can feel the pulp and maybe a seed or two in your mouth. And then for whatever reason, you grab that second quarter of a lemon, you hold it up, and you squeeze that one right into your mouth. And the power of the sour just immerses all of your taste buds. And your mouth is really just filled with the sensations and the flavors of a sour lemon. Okay, so you can stop the visualization activity now. And one of the things that might have happened when you were just visualizing putting a lemon in your mouth, you may have experienced, I did actually, even in describing it to you, a little bit of that sensation of increased saliva and that back of the mouth kind of prickly sensation of sourness. Some people will feel it so strongly they'll even wink because of how sometimes when you will eat a raw lemon, you will wink. So I hope you experience something. The point is to illustrate how with the lemon test, how we have lenses through which we experience and look at the world. The second one is just in our own brains, we can create visual imagery that affects us physically. If we can create visual imagery that affects us physically when there's nothing there, that just gives us a sense of the power of cognition in influencing us, not just emotionally, but also physically. So, continuing on the theme of self-awareness, thoughts are powerful. We study ourselves in order to develop self-awareness. We study ourselves and we gain experiences like the lemon test, like the lemon visualization, to develop awareness of our cognitions and how they're affecting us in our lives. So another thing that happens is we will have automatic thoughts and sometimes automatic explanations for things. Depending upon our history and our previous experiences, and maybe our genetics, and maybe some of the habits that we've developed, and maybe some of the exposure to American or other cultures that we've had in our lives, Our automatic thoughts will pop up in consistent and distinct ways. Now, when do they pop up? Almost always, automatic thoughts have a trigger. It's like something happens. There's a little trigger. And the automatic thoughts, and we're going to get into those in just a few minutes, will be interpretive. They will be perceptual. They will involve explanations and commentary about our experience or the trigger that we're experiencing. And the Becks would also say, as well as Ellis, that not only do we have these automatic thoughts, we also will have our own usual style of cognitive distortions. We have usually our own pattern. Some people will overgeneralize a lot. One thing happened and they generalize it to everything. They have one male who treats them in a very bossy way, and then they think all males are bossy, or they tend to overgeneralize about that. Personalization is another one that people often experience. This one I feel a lot, and I'm a little embarrassed to admit that, but sometimes if I hear some people laughing, I worry that maybe they're laughing at me. Sometimes, and maybe the most extreme example well, maybe not the most extreme, but one of the examples I can think of is like when I'm riding my bike, used to ride up and down the Rattlesnake to get to the university. It just felt like the wind was against me both directions. And it was usually against me even more when I was in a hurry. And so I would feel like it was personal. And of course, turns out it's not. But I would still have thoughts about that. People often will magnify or minimize their experiences and their reactions. And sometimes we will catastrophize, like I mentioned before. So those are some examples of cognitive distortions. I think there's some more in the reading. As I mentioned, where do they come from? Often early experiences, sometimes genetics, often habits. And really, we are in many ways trained or taught to respond to particular triggers in particular ways by our culture. An example of that is the idea that there is an axe murderer in the basement when you hear a sound in the night. But there are many other examples of how our culture gets into our brains and interprets for us some of our experiences. In the end, for the ACT people, acceptance and commitment therapy, and CBT, it doesn't matter where they come from. These are two approaches where we don't need to go back to the past. We don't need to dig up the past. We're having these cognitions. We don't have to go back to the past and root them out. We need to notice them. We need to put them in perspective. We need to evaluate them for accuracy and helpfulness, and then either replace them or let them be. Now, one of the things that is used in the ACT approach to counseling and psychotherapy, one of the things that they do is they'll get a clipboard to demonstrate how thoughts can dominate. And so if your thoughts are on, say, this clipboard, which is empty, but if the thoughts are on there and I'm staring at my thoughts a lot, I can't see past my own thinking. And so what the ACT people say is, don't dispute or argue with your thoughts, just move them to the side so that they're not in the way of the ways in which we see or experience the world, that they're over here and we can look at them and say, oh yeah, that thought's useful here, but not here. So that's a very much an ACT approach or technique that they sometimes use with clients. Albert Ellis was much more aggressive. You can see this is a quote from Albert Ellis. He would often say to his clients, what the holy hell are you thinking? Now, that's pretty aggressive, right? But to be honest, every once in a while, it can be useful for me to have someone say to me, John, what the holy hell are you thinking? Because the thinking becomes so entrenched, and it's really useful to have somebody push me out of my perspective. And the Becks would say, let's do Socratic questioning. Let's ask people if the thoughts are helpful. let's ask them together. We'll do this thing that the Becks refer to as collaborative empiricism. Let's test the thoughts together to see if they are either accurate or useful, or perhaps neither. So, for example, I have a thought, let's say, I will never have a long-term loving relationship. And maybe underneath that thought is a belief I'm defective, I'm unlovable. That's a core belief. And so those thoughts come whenever maybe I'm in or trying to get in a relationship or the relationship goes badly. Those thoughts are triggered and activated. When I'm in a relationship and it's going well, I'm probably not thinking those thoughts very often. But if I get triggered by a fight, or if I get triggered by my romantic partner doesn't seem to want to be with me, or if I get triggered by a breakup, I might then start having lots of thoughts about, I'm never going to have a long-term romantic loving relationship. I am unlovable. No one ever will want to spend a long-term relationship time with me. And those thoughts, even when there may be some truth to them, are usually too extreme. They're too overgeneralized. In fact, I maybe just I was maybe in a relationship that felt pretty good for a while. And so in some ways, that is evidence against the fact that I could never possibly be in a relationship. I have been in one before. Maybe it didn't work out perfectly, but that doesn't necessarily dictate that the next relationship will fail as well. And so those are the kinds of questions that we might ask from the Beck cognitive therapy perspective. What do you think? What do you think of the truth of the possibility that you will never get in another romantic relationship again? What's the evidence that supports that you are, in fact, unlovable? And so we might also look for exceptions and say, well, what is there about you that someone was attracted to in the past, or that you think might be something about yourself that is lovable? So we would try to do that gently and collaboratively from the Beck's perspective. So just before I have us watch a short CBT video, a couple of caveats. One is that CBT is not designed to make bad experiences or bad feelings go away, okay? The truth is we all have hard, traumatic, incredibly painful, emotional, physical, psychological experiences. The purpose of CBT is not to make those things go away, but to help us cope as best we can with those difficult things. To make sure that our negative cognitions are not piling on to a bad experience or the bad feelings and making it worse than it might be otherwise. So CBT is really about managing our thoughts in ways that make things a little bit better, even the hard things a little bit better. So that's a couple of CBT caveats. Now, we're going to do a little CBT with yourself. Before we watch a clip, I want all of us to be thinking in terms of these 6 columns. And I have posted a whole bunch of different examples of them on our friend Moodle. And so Moodle has these, and access them, look at them, and use them to whatever extent they're helpful to you. But in every case, we can look at a situation, and I've got 3 different situations here. I want you to imagine for a moment your date is late. What automatic thoughts and what emotions do you feel? Sometimes it's easier to begin with the emotions and say, oh, I feel betrayed, I feel angry, I feel sad. And so it's good to look at the emotions and to rate them. Usually on a scale of 0 to 100, 100 would be I'm so angry that I'm exploding. 0 would be I have no anger at all. And then we also look at, well, then the big point that the CBT or the cognitive therapists make is that it's not the situation or the trigger that produces the emotion. It's the automatic thoughts and the behaviors that contribute to our emotions, that shape and magnify or minimize our emotions. And so we also can come up with helpful thoughts and helpful behaviors that might be better than our automatic knee-jerk reactions, and that might give us some new or better emotional outcomes. So I have my date is late. That's a classic. Oftentimes that will feed our cognitions, or maybe somebody texts someone, you text them again, you text them a third time, they don't text you back. Oftentimes that will trigger lots of cognition about why isn't this person getting back to me? What a jerk, or maybe they don't love me. I was just diagnosed with, this is a hard one. I mean, we could fill in the blank with cancer or high blood pressure or asthma or any one of a number of things that could be really challenging. Again, the point is not that practicing CBT is going to make the diagnosis go away, but it might help us deal with the diagnosis with a little less pain and misery. My parents called and my brother is in jail. This is a really bad news that you receive, and it will often trigger a cascade of thoughts. Maybe a cascade of thoughts about what you should do, what you didn't do, and so there may be some guilt or other kinds of reactions that you have to my parents called and my brother is in jail. All right, so now we're going to do a short video. It's about 13 minutes. I'll probably stop it a little bit and make some comments. I'm working with a young woman named Meredith. At the time, Meredith was a doctoral student in our counseling program. She volunteered to be interviewed. I'm sure Meredith is thrilled that I show her video all the time. She's being herself. Everyone who was in our video project, usually we ask them to be themselves and not to do a role play. So she's talking about a real life situation. I think it's one that you can relate to because it's a classroom situation. I want you to think about, of course, those columns that I just showed you. Think about the triggers, the automatic thoughts, the automatic behaviors, the emotions, the sensations, the ratings of those, helpful thoughts, behaviors, new emotions, and sensations, and the ratings of those. All right, so here is Meredith and JSF.
We know each other, and but the way we usually start a CBT session is to set an agenda.
Okay.
And so we might have several ideas about what we want on the agenda, but the first thing is usually for us to make a problem list.
Okay.
Together, whatever it is that you might want to work on.
Okay.
And then we'll do the problem list, and then we'll explore the thoughts and the behaviors that might be related to the problem. Hopefully by the end of our time together, we'll have a clearer idea about what's causing the problem and some ideas how to maybe change things.
Sounds good.
All right.
So, one thing that I've been noticing lately is that I have a tendency to kind of hang back in groups.
Mm-hmm.
And I tend to observe instead of participate.
Okay.
And a lot of times I get really nervous when I feel like I'm expected to speak up. And I want to speak up, but I kind of feel like I freeze.
Okay. And so in particular then, in groups, the setting is big groups, little groups, does it matter?
It doesn't matter a whole lot, but generally I guess medium size, like, you know, in classes that I have. So
Yeah.
we usually like maybe 12 people or so relatively small, medium. I don't know what size that is.
Okay. And so, but in your head, you probably would say, I would like to speak up, but for some reason you feel inside some anxiety or nervousness about that?
Definitely.
Okay.
And then sometimes when I try to force myself to speak up, when I actually don't feel ready, I get like, I feel like my throat's closing and I get a red face.
Okay. All right, so that's sort of one possible issue for us to talk about.
There's just a little slide here. I'm not sure why this has happened, but We're back.
Could you maybe give me a specific example of a particular group situation, very as recent as you can, where you had this feeling of hanging back and maybe some fear of evaluation?
Mm-hmm. So in my statistics class, each week we have it's called an inclusion activity.
Mm-hmm.
And generally, I guess it's supposed to help people feel like the group's more cohesive and included.
Okay.
But I usually experience it as the opposite. So there's usually a task at the beginning of each class of like, take off your shoe and talk about the most interesting place your shoe has been. Stuff like this.
In stats.
Yeah.
Okay.
That usually I get really nervous and I feel like I can't think of anything to say, and
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I usually end up saying something really awkward or lame, and I just
Mm-hmm.
don't feel good about it. Like I feel.
Yeah. Can you give me that specific example of the recent time when maybe, and what you said too, including sort of the beginning, what happened, and then.
Just a quick pause, a couple of comments. So we have both a general scenario or trigger situation that is problematic for Meredith, being in groups and having the expectation that she should speak up or she wants to speak up. She also, so that's the left-hand column trigger. That's in general, but also now we're going to explore a specific situation in her stats class and go through exactly what happened. And oftentimes going through exactly what happened with a specific scenario can be illuminating, and that's why we've done that. Interestingly, early on also, Meredith told us her throat closes down and she gets red in the face. And so she has talked about some physiological sensations that she has that probably go along with certain emotions that she's going to tell us about a little bit later. One other comment, she says over and over again, it feels like, it feels like. Now, it feels like is a phrase that almost always represents thinking or cognition. Feels like I'm going to fail. It feels like people will make fun of me. And so those are actual perceptions as opposed to emotions. And so when we're thinking about where certain experiences belong in our 6 columns, I just wanted to mention that phrase usually indicates that it's a thought and not a feeling.
Yeah, so when we did this activity, it's like a really weird example.
Yeah.
When we did this activity, you know, probably 6 or 7 people had gone in front of me, and I was like not listening to anything that anyone else was saying, just totally self-absorbed in terms of like, oh God, what am I gonna say? And not being able to think of anything.
Mm-hmm.
And then when it was my turn, I was wearing a pair of shoes that like are kind of like they have lace on them, and so I took it off and I said, I like these shoes because I get cool tan lines from them. So I didn't even really answer the question that was like where have these shoes been, or like the coolest place these shoes have been, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then after I went, I didn't really listen to anything else anyone said because I was still like stuck on why didn't I answer the question, and just kind of feeling awkward.
Okay. So what I'm doing here is I've got several columns that I'm building, and the first one is you're in the stats class and you're going through an inclusion activity, and the second one is the thoughts that you're having.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what thoughts are going through your mind, and the thoughts are, oh God, what am I going to say?
Mm-hmm.
Those are the early thoughts, and then maybe the later thoughts are, why didn't I even answer the question?
Yeah, and like, why can't I ever be articulate?
Okay. Why can't I ever be articulate? Okay. And then our third column are the emotions that you might be feeling. And so as you're in that situation and people are taking their turn. The teacher says you're doing the inclusion activity. People are taking their turns, and what are you feeling? How would you describe your emotional state?
Nervous. Yeah, like fearful.
Okay.
And like it's almost like I'm anticipating embarrassment. So I don't know if that's a feeling or not, but usually I feel embarrassed.
I put that in the thought
Okay.
column just because it seems like the anticipation of it is probably a thought, but embarrassment when you're in the middle of it is probably a feeling. Does that make sense? And then, so I got nervous, fearful, embarrassed as the emotions. And on a scale of 0, not at all, 100 being the most of that feeling you could ever have, how would you rate? Let's get rid of nervous because it's sort of covered by fearful. How would you rate fearful, and how would you rate embarrassed?
Maybe fearful, like a 4.
Okay.
Or a 5. I don't know.
4 out of 5 out of 100.
45.
Okay. I was gonna say, whoa, feeling pretty calm. So a 40 or a 50.
Yeah.
Okay. And embarrassed,
I'd say that's higher.
a little higher.
Yeah, like a 70.
So maybe a 70. And that would be at the moment that you're talking, or right afterwards, or right before. Fluctuate at all?
Yeah, I'd say like both during and after.
Okay. Okay, so during and after. All right, and so the cognitive approach to thinking about what's going on is that it's not the situation that causes the emotional reaction, but it's what you're thinking that causes the emotional reaction. And so it seems to me like one of the things that's going on, oh God, what am I going to say? And why didn't I answer? Why can't I never be articulate?
Why can't I never be articulate? That
Yeah,
sounds exactly
it's perfect. My anxiety now too. And then I guess there's the other thing you said, that you're anticipating embarrassment. And so are those words too also that are going through your head?
Yeah. Like, I wish I could be more clever, or I wish I could have just like a funny story right now.
Yeah.
Or make people laugh in a way that I want them to laugh.
So I'm supposed to do some commentary here. I think the most important comment is that we're trying to put words on the cognitions.
And one of the things I'm doing now is a lot of times when you think about the thoughts that trigger the emotions, these are the thoughts that we would categorize as less helpful, okay? Kind of unhelpful thoughts. And then over here, what we're doing is we're coming up with some thoughts that might be more helpful, okay? Not recognizing that no thoughts are perfect, but some thoughts are more helpful, some thoughts are less helpful. And in your SAS class, you're going to do the inclusion activity
Every week.
And so one possibility is you could come in prepared to shift your thinking from the less helpful to the more helpful. Just an idea.
It's a good idea.
Okay. So what else besides this is silly and what I say doesn't matter all that much?
I can be clever sometimes.
I can be clever sometimes. Good. That's sort of a counter to the why can't I ever be articulate?
Yeah.
Or why can't I never be articulate? Either way you say it. Let's pretend for a second that you were talking to a friend who had exactly this same scenario, and she was telling you the way that she talks to herself, oh God, what am I going to say? And why can't I answer that? Why can't I ever be articulate? I know I'm going to embarrass myself. And so she's talking to herself that way. How would you talk to her?
I think that I probably express surprise because I imagine that usually I don't perceive her as inarticulate or as embarrassing as she sees herself.
Okay, so you would be surprised and kind of reassuring to her and say, oh, you don't seem that way. And if you could be on her shoulder in the situation, what would you whisper in her ear? This is a good friend of yours. You want to be helpful.
I would tell her that she's funny and charming and usually has really cool stories to tell because she's had lots of good experiences.
So you'd be sitting on her shoulder saying things like, you are funny and charming and you have cool stories to tell. What's it feel like when you imagine actually even saying those words to yourself in this kind of situation?
I mean, it sounds pretty ideal, but it sounds really far away from my current experience.
It's not what you're whispering in your own ear.
No.
What would stop you from actually doing this? From talking to yourself, just like you would talk to a good friend?
Right, so we are stopping the video with Meredith. I wanted to give you a feel for that particular process and how it looks. I'm now going to move to the next one. Here we go. So here you can see I've started to fill out the 6 columns with Meredith. The group discussions in class in general, stats class in particular, automatic thoughts and behaviors. Oh God, what am I going to say? I didn't answer the question. Why can't I ever be articulate? I'm anticipating embarrassment. I put down the emotions and sensations and the ratings. And then one of the things that we started working on were more helpful thoughts, working on this 4th column. And I gave her the assignment to imagine that she was whispering on her own shoulder and whispering in her ear like she was her best friend. And I found, and I think she did, that it was a little surprising how positive she might talk to herself, although that's a long ways from what she's currently experiencing. And what this illustrates is that oftentimes it takes a bunch of practice. And that's why we work so hard on awareness up front, so that Meredith can be aware of this repeating pattern, and she can be aware of the less helpful thoughts and behaviors she engages in. And then she can begin to, in anticipation of having to talk in class, she can start to plan, and not just plan, but also practice some of the helpful thoughts and some of the helpful behaviors, and hopefully then achieve some new outcomes, new emotional outcomes. Now, I would like you to take a break. We're going to take a break here in a moment for you to do some CBT with yourself. I want you to start with A, B, or C, which would be the situation, the trigger, or B, the automatic thoughts and behaviors, the beliefs is what Albert Ellis called them. And the emotions, which are C, or the consequent emotions, is what Ellis referred to these as. So I want you to start with one of those. Sometimes it helps for you to think, oh, I feel very nervous in this situation. I feel angry in that situation. I feel sad in this situation. And maybe I could take the edge off of those feelings. And so that might make it a really good scenario for you to try to do a little CBT with yourself. Again, where to start, let yourself take a time out now. We're going to take a break. I'll be back with part 2 soon. Let yourself experience or explore the trigger, the automatic thoughts, behaviors, the emotions, and the rating. Get out one of those blank or partially filled in 6-column techniques that's posted on Moodle, and have fun. I'll see you back in just a little while.